This is the Dizzy Bowl project I'm calling the Segmented Dizzy Bowl. When I made my previous Dizzy Bowl patterns, I started out with a laminated board such as this, consisting of between 60 and 150 layers of wood of contrasting colors. And then from this board I cut my disc to produce my Dizzy Bowl patterns. But if you notice on these discs, all the boards run in the same direction. And when you produce the Dizzy Bowl patterns with this, from these outer layers, you get these patterns such as this here. From the inner layers, the straight inner layers, you get less interesting patterns. You just get these straight angled patterns on the bowl. So my thought was to see less of these straight inner patterns and more of these fancier patterns on my bowl. And I accomplished this by making a board, a laminated board with 39 strips of contrasting colors, and then cutting these on my Accu-Slice system into 5 wedges. And then from these 5 wedges, producing my disc. It's a combination of the Dizzy Bowl pattern and the segmented wedge techniques. And in doing this, I see more of these outer layers and less of the inner layers of my board. So as a result, when I produce my Dizzy Bowl from these 5 segmented wedges, I have 5 of these repeating patterns. A little more interesting pattern on the Dizzy Bowl. So in this video we'll describe the various procedures that I've used to make this project. Beginning this project with 39 strips of wood. These strips are all 1 3/4 inches wide, about 30 inches long, and they vary in thickness from about 1/8 of an inch down to 20/1000 of an inch. And again, it is a symmetrical pattern, going from a solid piece in the middle and then radiating out in a symmetrical pattern. For the glue up of the wood strips, I'm using the West epoxy system. This epoxy gives me about an hour setup time. Epoxy is applied to both sides of the laminated strips, which are then stacked on top of each other, maintaining my pre-designed pattern for the layers. After epoxy has been applied to all layers, the assembled wood strips are then inserted into the glue-up jig in a cradle of wax paper. The wax paper cradle prevents the epoxy from messing up the glue-up jig. The glued wood strips are then clamped with C-clamps, and the excess epoxy is wiped off. The glued laminated strips are allowed to cure and harden overnight. The next morning, the glued laminated board is removed from the glue-up jig. The laminated board is then passed through the joiner planer to remove the excess epoxy and provide for clean, straight surfaces. This is followed by running the laminated board through my board sander to smooth the surfaces and ensure that the 2 surfaces of the laminated board are parallel to one another. I have my strip all ready. I'm going to be cutting wedges at 5 segments per ring. And I'm going to be cutting like this because I want to round this off to get my Dizzy Bowl pattern. So I have it set for 5 increments or 5 segments on my plate, and line my first cut up so I can do my first cut. I'm using a 3/4 inch wide blade, 14 teeth per inch on the bandsaw. After making my first cut, I set the Accu-Stop to enable the cutting of wedges that come to a perfect point in the center when they're reassembled. From this 30-inch long laminated board, I was able to cut 20 wedges, which will produce 4 segmented discs. Next, we sand the corners on the wedges to remove the fuzzies and any burrs that are on the edges of the wedges, using some 220 grit sandpaper. Sets of 5 wedges are then assembled and checked for alignment. So once again, I'm using the West epoxy system to glue these 5 segments together. Epoxy is applied to both surfaces of each of the wedges. The wedges are then clamped with rubber bands and allowed to cure and harden overnight. So I took the clamps off these now. Now I'm going to make these round circles. So I'm just going to draw a circle, cutting as little off as possible. And then I'll cut these, instead of cut these on the scroll saw, I think I'll just sand them around. I could cut these on the saber saw to get them round, but there's not a whole lot to take off, so I'm just going to try using my edge sander to round them off. The blocks are sanded to the inscribed line to produce perfectly round discs. So now I want to get every bit of use of this board all the way down to the very bottom. So rather than use double-sided tape, I'm actually going to glue these to a piece of MDF, and that way I can cut all the way down right to the glue joint. Not worry about gumming up the blade with the double-sided tape. So let's go ahead and glue these up to the board. And once again, you can see I did put lines on here just for alignment purposes. So when I cut these off later, I'll make sure those lines are all used for my orientation. Okay, ready to start cutting these on the bandsaw. My boards that I glued to this sacrificial fence. Attach it to the So I zeroed out my index wheel. Lock my system, and I'm ready to start cutting. So once again, I'll be cutting 3 turns on a wheel. 1 turn for the curve of the blade, which is 50 thousandths, and 2 turns will give me pieces 100 thousandths of an inch thick. This first cut again is just to square off the boards. So now at each of those discs, I got 10 discs. Wasn't enough material left to get 11th, but I got 10 discs, each a 1/10 of an inch thick. So I got to clear off this burr, which you can probably see on here. That's where the blade kicks out at the end, so that blade has to be sanded off and get rid of the fuzzies on the edge. So I can do this 2 ways. I can do it manually, like I've done here. And the other thing I've been doing is using the sand flea, which works pretty nice. What I like about the sand flea is these discs are pretty thin, they're pretty fragile. When I'm doing this, I'm putting some tension on the piece that could easily break. With the sand flea, you just push it through like this and it cleans up both the burr and the fuzzies. So I think that's what I'll do going forward, use the sand flea. And this is the sand flea system I was describing. It's a flat table with a sandpaper belt here, and it works good for passing these through to clean up the fuzzies on the edge, and if your surface was a little bit rough, it would clean it up. But my surface here is so smooth that it really needs no sanding. But this is just another way to clean up the edges, and usually I do 1 pass on each side while it's running. And there I have my 40 disc, all nice and tight, no fuzzies, no burrs, and those glue up to nice tight joints. And they have 4 glue-up jigs, one for each of the 4 boards I cut. So they're nice, tight fitting, nice, snug, so there's very little play in them. And I've been looking at my angle, and I decided to go with 5 degrees on my angle. Nice. And I'm using Type Bond 2 for this next step, because I don't want to use epoxy because it would be too long of a setup time. I want these to set up pretty quickly. After applying glue to both surfaces, the 2 discs are inserted into the glue-up jig and rotated to the predetermined angle. Spring clamps are then applied, and the alignment is rechecked to make sure that the 2 discs did not move during the clamping. The glue disc remained clamped for at least 10 minutes to permit the glue to set. The gluing of the disc is continued until sets of 5 discs have been created. Well, I've organized all my layers, and I actually put marks in here for the alignment, so they're all ready to glue up. So I'm using a face plate again. I've glued my base already onto there. Now I'm going to start gluing up my layer, starting with my first layer. After gluing the first layer, the 2 discs are clamped and allowed to set for at least 10 minutes before the next disc is attached. Okay, for the second and subsequent layers, I've put marks on here so I know for alignment exactly how I want it to align. So these are pre-set up offline, so I get my correct alignment from one disc to the next. So I'll just align those up with those lines and glue it up. Apply light pressure with the tailstock and wipe off the excess glue. Okay, this is the 8th layer, and these were a bit of a bear to align. And it's a good thing I aligned them off the system. And I put marks on here which made it much easier to align. So I'm just aligning to the marks. But you see the pattern development is pretty good. And then after this I have one more layer, which would be a cap ring, which is a 24 segment Accu-Slice ring. Okay, this all glued up now. There were 8 layers, each layer being 5, so that's 40 layers of my 5 segment dizzy bowl pattern. And then I have a Accu-Slice 24 member ring on the bottom and another one on the top. So let me start turning this to get it round, see what it looks like. My preference is to use a round carbide lathe chisel for turning the dizzy bowl projects. The pattern is emerging and it looks pretty good. So I will continue to refine the outside shape. Next I turn the inside of the bowl, using a Carter multi-rest for increased stability. So this is 5 segments of the dizzy bowl. That's why we get these 1, 2, 3, 4, 5 patterns going around. And the same thing in here, 5 patterns. I think I'm going to take a little bit more off in here. Work on the base some more. And might nick down here a little bit more too. Here I'm using a Hunter Osprey bull gouge to turn this narrow neck of the bull. I finished by sanding starting at 150 grit down to 400 grit sandpaper. I finished the turning of this segmented dizzy bowl. So now I'll finish cutting it off and give it a couple coats of bushwax and some polyurethane, and it'll be done. There's the finished bowl, both inside and outside. And I did finish the bottom. So let me get a couple coats of bush oil and then some polyurethane. So we got a repeating pattern of 5 dizzy patterns. This is the finished segmented dizzy bowl after 2 coats of bush oil.